She didn't deny it. She didn't even look nervous. When I asked who she was texting at midnight, she smiled slightly and said, "You're insecure." That was it. No explanation. No reassurance. Just a label, placed on me like a flaw she'd already diagnosed. I remember standing there, confused by how calm she was, how easily she dismissed the question. I said, "I'm your husband. I'm allowed to ask." She rolled her eyes and told me I was imagining things, that my jealousy was exhausting. In that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my own marriage. Not angry, not loud, just quietly erased. Something clicked as she spoke. This wasn't innocence. This was distance. This was someone who wasn't worried about losing me anymore. As she turned away, completely unbothered, I realized the most terrifying part wasn't the suspicion. It was how quickly she made me doubt my own reality, and how little my concern meant to her. Before the cheating, our marriage looked normal from the outside. Stable, predictable in a way I took comfort in. We had built a routine that felt solid, shared responsibilities, inside jokes, quiet nights that didn't need excitement to feel meaningful. I trusted her completely. Loyalty wasn't something I questioned because she'd never given me a reason to. We talked about the future like it was guaranteed, not fragile. I believed we were a team, that even when things got hard, we'd face them together. If there were cracks back then, I didn't see them. Or maybe I didn't want to. I thought commitment meant security, and security meant safety. I had no idea that while I was settling deeper into the marriage, she was slowly emotionally detaching, learning how to live without accountability long before betrayal ever entered the picture. The changes were easy to miss because none of them felt dramatic on their own. She became more private in ways I told myself were healthy. Her phone was always face down, always locked, always within reach. She started needing more space, more time alone, more evenings where she was suddenly busy. Conversations lost their depth. When I talked, she listened just enough to respond, not to understand. Affection faded in small increments. Less eye contact, fewer casual touches, a subtle stiffness when I leaned in. When I noticed, I blamed stress, work, adulthood. I didn't want to be the guy who questioned normal shifts in a long marriage. Every time something fell off, I reminded myself of who she'd been, not who she was becoming. I trusted history more than my instincts. Looking back, that's what hurts the most. The signs were there, quietly lining up, and I kept stepping around them because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that something important was already breaking. There were red flags that, in hindsight, feel impossible to ignore. At the time, I worked overtime to explain every single one away. She started mentioning new people at work, but avoided details, like names were optional. Her schedule stopped making sense. Late nights that didn't match deadlines, sudden errands that couldn't wait. When I asked simple questions, her tone shifted instantly. Not defensive in a guilty way, but annoyed, like I was wasting her time. She'd say things like, "Why do you need to know everything?" Or, "You're being controlling," turning curiosity into a character flaw. I accepted that framing because I didn't want conflict. I told myself trust meant silence. Even when I noticed inconsistencies, stories that changed slightly each time, I blamed stress, miscommunication, my own memory. I started pre-editing my thoughts before speaking, choosing words carefully so I wouldn't sound insecure. That should have scared me. Instead, I treated it like growth. I convinced myself that relationships required patience, that doubt was immaturity. What I was really doing was training myself to ignore my instincts and prioritize her comfort over my reality. Every red flag became a test. I failed by choosing denial. Not because I was blind, but because seeing clearly would have forced me to accept a truth I wasn't ready to face. The first moment something truly felt wrong wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost embarrassing in how small it was. We were sitting at the kitchen table, barely talking, when I mentioned a trip we talked about taking later that year. She didn't argue. She didn't engage. She just said, "We'll see," without looking up. That phrase landed heavier than it should have. It wasn't uncertainty, it was detachment. Like she couldn't even pretend to imagine a future that included me. I remember watching her scroll on her phone, completely absorbed, while I sat there feeling invisible. I felt a tightness in my chest, a kind of emotional vertigo. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a bad week. This was absence. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that I might already be alone in this marriage. I pushed it away quickly, ashamed of even thinking it. But once that feeling showed up, it didn't leave. It stayed with me, quiet and persistent, whispering that something fundamental had shifted, and I was the last one to admit it. Her language shifted in ways that were subtle but constant, like erosion you don't notice until the ground is gone. She stopped saying we altogether. Everything became I, me, my time, my space. When I talked about us, she responded like I was being sentimental about something outdated. Questions were no longer invitations to connect. They were irritations. Concern became pressure. Discomfort became your issue. If I expressed hurt, she reframed it as insecurity. Why do you always need reassurance? You're reading too much into things. You need to work on yourself. The calmness of her delivery was the most unsettling part. There was no anger to react to, no emotion to meet, just a steady dismissal that made me feel unreasonable for even speaking. I started noticing how carefully she chose words that shut conversations down instead of opening them up. Language wasn't just communication anymore. It was a boundary, a way to keep me at a distance while making it sound like the distance was my fault. By the time the affair actually began, the emotional distance was already complete. We were living parallel lives in the same house, sharing space, but not connection. She was present physically, but emotionally unavailable in a way that felt deliberate. When I tried to talk, she'd give short answers, eyes drifting back to her phone or the TV. There was no curiosity about my day, no follow-up questions, no warmth. Affection felt awkward, almost intrusive, like I was crossing an invisible line by asking for it. Intimacy faded until it felt mechanical, then disappeared altogether. I told myself this was just what long marriages went through: phases, stress, exhaustion. I kept believing that if I tried harder, things would return to normal. What I didn't realize was that she wasn't struggling with distance the way I was. She was comfortable in it. While I was still trying to reconnect and repair what I felt slipping away, she had already emotionally detached, creating space for someone else long before I knew there was even a problem. The lies started piling up in ways that felt almost careless. Not dramatic cover stories, just explanations that fell apart the moment you thought about them. She'd say she was meeting a friend, but couldn't remember which one. She'd claim she was exhausted from work, yet stay out late without looking tired at all. Details shifted depending on when I asked. When I pointed out the gaps, she didn't correct them. She challenged me for noticing. "Why are you so focused on this?" she'd say. "You're obsessing." Somehow, the conversation always ended with me apologizing for asking reasonable questions. I began replaying interactions in my head, checking myself, wondering if I was actually the problem. That was the most damaging part. The lies weren't just about where she was or who she was with. They were about eroding my confidence in my own perception. The more they didn't make sense, the more she insisted nothing was wrong. And the calmer she became, the more unstable I felt. Looking back, the truth wasn't hidden well at all. It was just buried under repetition and denial until I stopped trusting myself. I didn't discover the cheating through a confession or some dramatic showdown. It came out in the most ordinary, devastating way possible. Her phone lit up while she was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't even looking for proof. But the message preview was enough. His name, a tone that was intimate in a way that didn't belong to me. My stomach dropped instantly. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I opened the phone, and everything unraveled fast. Deleted threads. A second messaging app. Conversations that made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse. This had been going on for a while. My hands were shaking as I scrolled, my chest tight, my mind racing to catch up with reality. Every doubt I'd buried suddenly made sense. I wasn't insecure. I wasn't paranoid. I had been right all along, and realizing that didn't bring relief. It brought a crushing clarity that the person I trusted most had been lying to me without hesitation and without remorse. I confronted her as soon as she came out of the bathroom. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just held the phone out and asked her to explain what I'd seen. She glanced at the screen, then back at me, completely calm. No panic. No denial. Just a tired sigh, like this conversation was inconvenient. "You went through my phone?" she asked, focusing on that instead of the messages. When I said I saw the notification by accident, she shrugged and said, "This is exactly what I meant when I said you're insecure." That word again. I asked her who he was. She answered casually, without detail, like it wasn't worth explaining. When I asked if she'd slept with him, She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Flat. Unemotional. I felt like I was falling apart in front of her while she stayed perfectly steady. Every question I asked was met with irritation, not guilt. It became clear I wasn't confronting a mistake. I was confronting someone who had already decided I was the problem for reacting at all. What stunned me wasn't the admission. It was what never followed. I asked her if she felt bad, if any part of her understood what this had done to me. She looked at me like I'd asked something unreasonable. Why would I, she said. No hesitation. No pause to soften it. She explained that she'd been unhappy, that things had been off for a long time, as if that justified everything. When I told her I was devastated, she accused me of making it about myself. You're blowing this out of proportion, she said calmly. It's not that deep. Hearing that felt worse than the cheating itself. She wasn't conflicted. She wasn't ashamed. She had already rewritten the story in her head where my pain was an inconvenience and her actions were inevitable. In that moment, I realized I wasn't talking to someone who felt remorse. I was standing in front of someone who had emotionally checked out so completely that guilt no longer existed for her at all. After that conversation, I broke in a way I didn't recognize. There was no dramatic outburst, no yelling or throwing things. I just went numb. It felt like everything holding me together finally gave up at once. My body was there, but my mind kept drifting, replaying her words on a loop. Why would I feel bad? That sentence lodged itself deep and wouldn't let go. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every quiet moment was filled with a crushing weight in my chest, like grief had turned physical. I remember sitting alone in the dark, realizing that the person who was supposed to care the most about me could watch me unravel and feel nothing. That realization stripped something essential from me. I wasn't just mourning the affair. I was mourning the marriage I thought I had, the trust one built my identity around, and the version of myself who believed love automatically meant empathy. The collapse wasn't loud. It was internal, slow, and absolute, like something inside me had finally accepted that there was nothing left to save. The decision to stop chasing didn't feel empowering at first. It felt like giving up on something I had already lost. I noticed how I kept trying to explain myself, hoping that if I found the right words, she'd finally understand the damage she'd done. I was chasing an apology, some sign of regret, anything that would confirm I still mattered. But every attempt ended the same way, with her indifference. One night, I caught myself rehearsing another conversation in my head and suddenly felt exhausted by my own desperation. That's when it hit me. I was fighting for empathy from someone who had none left for me. I realized that chasing her remorse was only deepening the humiliation. So I stopped. I stopped asking questions. I stopped defending my feelings. I stopped trying to be understood by someone who had already decided I was the problem. It wasn't strength yet. It was survival. Letting go was the first boundary I'd set since the truth came out. And even though it hurt, it was the first moment I chose self-respect over hope. The distance that followed wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, almost clinical. I pulled back emotionally without announcing it. I stopped initiating conversations. I stopped reacting to her tone, her indifference, her subtle dismissals. We existed in the same house like two separate worlds that occasionally crossed paths. She noticed the change, but she didn't chase it. That told me everything. There was no panic, no concern, no attempt to reconnect. If anything, she seemed more at ease, like my detachment removed an inconvenience from her life. I started protecting my energy, spending time alone, thinking clearly for the first time in months. The less I engaged, the lighter I felt. Distance wasn't a punishment, it was a shield. Detachment wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. I wasn't becoming cold. I was finally seeing her as she was, not as the person I kept hoping she'd be. And once that illusion broke, staying emotionally close to her was no longer possible or necessary. The hardest truth wasn't that she cheated. It was that she felt nothing afterward. No guilt, no regret, no instinct to comfort the damage she caused. When someone can look at your pain and dismiss it as insecurity or overreaction, the relationship is already over, whether the papers are signed or not. I spent too long trying to understand why, when the real answer was in her indifference. If someone cheats and then gaslights you for noticing, believe what their behavior is telling you. Remorse matters more than explanations. Love without empathy is emotional abandonment. Self-respect begins the moment you stop defending your reality to someone who benefits from denying it. Cheating hurts, but cheating without guilt, while making you feel like the problem, is the final betrayal.